Sunday morning, May 8th, 2005, Mother's Day. The air in the town of Zion, Illinois was filled with peace. While many families were gathering around the breakfast table, two girls, Laura Hobbs, 8, and Crystal Tobias, 9, left their house as usual. They were best friends who had grown up together, familiar with every corner and path around the park near their home. That morning was no different, a seemingly normal day, with blue skies and birds chirping in the trees along the road. No one expected that, a few hours later, the whole town would fall into panic. But by evening, the girls had not returned. From the initial anxiety, a large-scale search was quickly launched. Relatives, neighbors, police, and even dogs spread out throughout the park, every small path, every thicket. Darkness fell, and hope gradually faded. Until dawn. At 6 a.m., in the dim light of early morning, Laura's father, Jerry Hobbs, suddenly shouted in panic from the middle of the park, "I found them! They're dead!" It was no longer a search. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. A case that shook America, where the father, the first to find his daughter's body, became the prime suspect. But the truth, as it turned out, was far more horrifying. That afternoon, the town was still immersed in its familiar peace. No one noticed that, among the shady trees and the maze-like gravel road, two children were slowly disappearing from sight, never to return. Both disappeared into that seemingly harmless space. When dinner had cooled and there was no sign of her children, Laura's mother began to step out onto the porch, her eyes scanning the street. No one answered her calls. A feeling of unease crept in. The family quickly spread out along the streets, calling out Laura and Crystal's names in vain. As the night wore on, the fear grew. Neighbors gradually joined in. Flashlights were squinted through the bushes. Every corner of the park was carefully searched. At around 9 p.m., the police were called in. Dogs were brought in. Flyers with pictures of the two girls began to be hastily printed and distributed throughout the neighborhood. Despite the mobilization of many forces, the darkness and the absolute silence of the park left everyone with only one question. Where had the children gone? Night fell, but the anxiety grew. The whole town hardly slept. Every sound of a passing car made someone's heart skip a beat. By dawn, Jerry Hobbs had not given up. And then, a scream tore through the morning mist, cutting through the silence. No one knew what had just happened, but in that moment, the whole park froze. A horrifying revelation had just come, ending the search and opening a nightmare that would last for years to come. And that, unfortunately, put him at the center of the suspicion. After a long night, while many others had given up, Jerry Hobbs and his father-in-law continued to walk in silence. No one knew what they hoped for, only the silhouettes of two men quietly disappearing into the mist of dawn. The sky gradually turned to the pale gray of dawn. The first rays of sunlight had not yet penetrated the foliage when from deep in the park, a sudden scream rang out, tearing the silence. No one heard what he said, but when people ran towards them, they suddenly stopped. Not because of panic, but because they were facing something that no one dared to believe was true. The place was not far, only a few dozen meters from the main path, but all night no one stopped. Not because it was so dense, but because no one expected something so terrible to happen in the middle of a familiar park. But there, the truth had lain dormant for hours, under the rotting leaves and the cold morning mist. In the dark grass, two small bodies lay side by side in silence. Neither said a word. They seemed to have been waiting for someone together for hours in the dark. Within seconds of seeing the scene, Jerry pulled out his phone, his voice breaking in a 911 call. I found the kids. They're dead." The police arrived within minutes. They quickly cordoned off the area, asking everyone to keep their distance. Forensic units were called in. Yellow tape was strung around the bushes, and each location was carefully marked. The lieutenant in charge of the scene, a veteran, immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. There were no signs of a major struggle, but the amount of blood on the scene suggested a degree of brutality. The fact that both bodies were discovered by relatives also raised a big question. Why did he find the children when dozens of people with dogs had passed through the area the night before without seeing anything? Investigators quickly took Jerry and his father-in-law to headquarters to take initial statements. They also recorded the exact time of the call, the location of the bodies, and the emotional expression of the discoverer. The local press immediately got involved. The first headlines on the morning of May 9th were tragic. 2 girls murdered in park. Father of 1 victim finds bodies. The entire town of Zion was shaken. However, for the investigation team, the shock was even greater. Less than 12 hours after the discovery of the scene, they began to suspect Jerry Hobbs himself might have committed the crime. The area where the bodies were found was a dark patch of land, covered in dense vegetation and without streetlights. The bushes were almost as tall as a person, creating a natural barrier, making it easy to miss during nighttime searches. Under the damp grass, the ground showed signs of disturbance, suggesting the victims may have been dragged there from another location. The 2 girls were lying side by side, their clothes intact but stained with blood. Police found no personal belongings or tire tracks at the scene, an odd detail considering that both had been cycling to the park. The medical examiner conducted an autopsy that morning. Preliminary results showed that Laura Hobbs had been stabbed a total of 20 times, mostly in the chest and abdomen. Crystal Tobias had 11 similar stab wounds, but the level of brutality on Laura was clearly higher. The wound was sharp, indicating that the murder weapon was a small, sharp-pointed knife. However, the most notable detail came from the microscopic analysis. Traces of sexual assault appeared on Laura's body. Samples of strange skin cells under her fingernails and semen left on her clothes were collected for DNA testing. This was a clue that could shape the entire direction of the investigation. However, at that time, the police were still unable to determine the identity of the person who left this biological sample. From the moment the scene was sealed off, the investigators' suspicious eyes turned to one person, Jerry Hobbs. Although he was the victim's biological father, he was the one who discovered the body, while dozens of people and even police dogs searched all night and found nothing. That strange coincidence quickly put him in the crosshairs. Jerry's background was not very bright either. In the past, he had been arrested many times for violent behavior, especially a serious incident in 2001 in Texas, when he was accused of using a chainsaw to chase people after an argument with his wife. The incident caused his wife to take their child and leave, cutting off contact for many years. After completing a short prison sentence for violating probation, he returned to Zion, not long before the murder occurred. With all these negative signs, the police decided to invite Jerry to the headquarters to clarify the details. At first, the interrogation was gentle, but when it entered the 3rd hour, the investigators' attitude began to change. They not only focused on the gaps in his story, but also asked him a series of continuous questions, which quickly exhausted his mentality. Time passed in the closed room without windows. Without enough food or rest, Jerry gradually collapsed. After nearly 20 hours of non-stop questioning, he began to waver. When the investigators hypothesized that he might have lost control in a fit of anger, Jerry nodded. He began to tell a story that he met Laura and Crystal in the park that afternoon. Angry at his daughter's disobedience, he pulled Laura's hand back and the two argued. Crystal intervened, asking him to let go of her friend. According to the testimony, Crystal pulled a small knife from her pocket and threatened him. In a fit of rage, Jerry grabbed the knife and lost control, leading to tragedy. The confession was recorded, and Jerry was immediately arrested. The media quickly reported, "Father kills daughter in anger. Shocking confession." Many people could not believe their ears. Laura's family members were stunned, but others felt that there was something wrong with the confession. Indeed, just a few weeks after being detained, Jerry officially recanted all of his statements. He claimed that he had been forced to confess, and that when he had just found his daughter's body, he had completely collapsed. He said that he had not eaten or slept for 2 days, and that the investigators had repeatedly threatened that if he did not confess, he would never see his family again. Not only that, he also accused them of drawing up a script and forcing him to read it on camera as if it were a real confession. However, the prosecution refused to review the case. They insisted that the confession was voluntary and legally valid, especially when it was clearly recorded. So Jerry remained in custody, awaiting trial. Meanwhile, a lawyer assigned to defend Jerry began to sense that something was amiss. After reviewing the case file, her discovered that all the physical evidence collected from the crime scene, from blood stains to skin cells to DNA samples, had never been fully tested. They had simply been stored in the police department's refrigerator, as if the confession had made the biological samples unnecessary. Jerry's lawyer filed a request for an independent examination. After several delays, the lab finally conducted a full analysis of the samples in 2008, 3 years after the crime. The results were shocking. In addition to Laura's blood, there were at least 3 samples of foreign DNA on Laura's body. One of them was sperm, the other 2 were skin cells from under her fingernails and fibers from her shirt. Most importantly, none of the samples matched Jerry Hobbs. Despite being held for 3 years, he was biologically unrelated to the crime scene. The attorneys immediately asked the court to dismiss the charges and release their client. However, the prosecutors fiercely disputed this. They claimed that the foreign DNA could have come from Laura's accidental exposure to the environment, such as couples who had sex in the park. Although this explanation was considered dangerously implausible by many forensic experts, the court still refused to release Jerry. Undeterred, the attorneys asked that the foreign DNA be entered into a national database. The information was stored, awaiting the day when a match would be found. And that day came, but it took nearly 2 more years. In the spring of 2010, thousands of miles from Zion, an arrest was made in Virginia. A young soldier named Jorge Avila Torres was accused of raping and murdering a female soldier in his barracks apartment. When Torres' DNA was taken and entered into a federal database, it immediately matched the samples found on Laura Hobbs. After 5 years in prison for a false confession, Jerry Hobbs was finally cleared. But the damage he had done to his spirit, to his reputation, to his family, was irreparable. When the DNA results came back, the truth was indisputable. The person who left biological traces on Laura Hobbs's body was Jorge Avila Torres, a 21-year-old soldier who was incarcerated in Virginia for a series of serious crimes. Torres had served at the military base in Arlington and was considered a disciplined soldier. But behind that normal appearance was a dangerous predator. In an undercover operation, the police planted a person in his cell and recorded his chilling confession, from the murder of Amanda Snell, a young female soldier, to other kidnappings and rapes. When confronted with the evidence, Torres remained cool, even boasting about the details of what he had done as if it were an achievement. The trial in Virginia ended with Torres sentenced to death for Amanda's murder. He also received 5 life sentences and an additional 168 years for other sexual assaults and kidnappings. But it didn't stop there. Soon after his sentencing, Torres was extradited to Illinois to face charges of murdering Laura and Crystal. His defense attorney initially argued that the DNA evidence was not sufficient to prove murder. But the evidence was overwhelming. Torres had lived in Zion, knew Crystal's brother, and had easy access to the girls. Child witnesses at the time confirmed that they had seen Torres with friends in the park on the day of the murders. Seeing that he had no way out, Torres agreed to plead guilty in a deal with prosecutors. In exchange, he would be transferred from the prison where he was being threatened with violence and receive an additional 100 years in prison instead of facing a second death penalty trial. Meanwhile, Jerry Hobbs, a father who had been wrongly imprisoned for 5 years after a coerced confession, was finally released. After a lengthy legal battle, he received nearly $8 million in compensation from the state, but freedom did not bring a return to form. Jerry withdrew from public life, moving back to Texas, where he grew up. "They didn't have to torture me," he said in a rare interview. "I was shattered the moment I saw my daughter." His life, like the 2 young lives taken that year, will forever be tainted by an irreversible miscarriage of justice. 2 innocent girls never made it home after a short bike ride on a seemingly peaceful afternoon. The deaths of Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias are not only a tragedy for one family, but also a chilling warning to society as a whole. In the pain of losing his daughter, Jerry Hobbs was not allowed to hold his daughter's body one last time. Instead, he was handcuffed, locked in a cell, and labeled a murderer. Instead of upholding justice, the judicial system chose the fastest path, convicting a father who had just lost his child with a questionable confession. If the investigative agency had prioritized evidence over emotion from the beginning and had investigated objectively instead of jumping to conclusions, how many lives could have been saved? During the years Jerry was incarcerated, Jorge Avila Torres continued his criminal career. 1 woman was murdered, 3 others were raped and tortured. Each case is a painful reminder that investigative negligence not only denies justice, it also allows evil to continue. The story ends, but the consequences remain. How many people like Jerry Hobbs are still behind bars in America's prisons today? People deprived of their freedom not because of their crimes, but because of unforgivable failures in the system that was built to protect them?